Lace applique. You see this a lot in special occasion as well as intimate apparel. So this particular example is sewn with a zigzag free motion on the machine. I will demonstrate that first. And then the other example, this is a hybrid. This has some sewn in blanket stitch, some sewn in whip stitch, and the rest sewn zigzag hand guided. We have a lot here to do, so let's get busy. So when appliquing a lace motif to a ground, it works better if you hand baste rather than having to dodge around pins. That will make your life easier, especially for really any of the sewing. So I guess my takeaway here is don't skimp on basting. So there we are. So we have the motif basted into position. Next, the machine. Now, this is the free motion stitch. You can see I've worked ahead. And what this does, we're using our fingers to drive and steer. This is what's called a darning foot. And you drop the feed on your machine. And so this way of applique, you're using a narrow zigzag stitch. This is like a 1.5 width to overcast the edges of your motif onto the fabric. So when I have this finished, I will turn it over so you can see. But as you can see, the basting is really important because you don't want to have to dodge around pins when you're doing this. So, some people try to save time by not basting. Don't do that. As you can see here, we're coming up on the end. And I realize I'm stating the obvious, but you want to color match your thread to the lace so that this should disappear. This is a little quicker than hand sewing it. It's a little stronger as well, so if you're looking for strength, this is the one I would go for. Okay. There we are. Now let me show you. Under magnification, those stitches look quite large, but in reality they're not. And this is what it looks like from the back. So let me turn this. So next we will go to the work table to trim. We're back from the machine, and as you can see here, I'm taking out the basting because it's far easier to take out the basting now for the next step. So there we have our motif, and it's all sewn down. Now, the next step is removing the ground fabric from behind. This is something you want to be very careful when you're doing this, because you don't want to cut through the lace itself. You just want to cut close to the stitches So yes, you see how close we trim? I will go off camera and trim out and bring it back to you when I'm almost finished. So we are almost done. Okay, there we are. So as you can see, the light comes through. That is part of the charm of lace applique, is that you can see either the skin through or light. And that's what it will look like from behind. So this is the machine applique. So next I'm going to be showing you two different kinds of hand applique. Another way of appliquing lace to a ground fabric is with what's called Mara 30. This is a Gutermann thread. As you can see, it's Mara 30. And this is a buttonhole thread. So what we're doing, I've started already, we're going to be sewing this with a blanket stitch. The object here is to stitch and then have the thread behind the needle. And you can do this pretty much pointing up, pointing down. The object, though, is that the thread goes behind the needle. And when you pull this stitch closed, you want to pull it parallel to your fabric. So ideally, you color match everything. This should just look like part of the lace. Okay, so let me give you a close-up. That's what it should look like. Now I'm going to go off camera and sew a little more and bring it back here and show you the result. So here we have this sewed with the blanket stitch. And as I said earlier, if you match the thread to the lace, this will just look like part of the lace. On the back, that's what it looks like. So this is hand sewing lace applique with a blanket stitch. Next, I'm going to show you using the whip stitch. The next one is going to be called the whip stitch. You could use the Mara 30, but it would actually look a little better if you used just regular machine thread that matched. And this, as you'll see, is far quicker. You're just sewing a whip stitch over the edge of your motif. Now you could use this method for sewing lace seams together as well, but you want to keep the stitches fairly close together, because if you have them too far apart, this runs the risk of tearing loose from the ground fabric. So the stitches should be about 2 millimeters at the most from each other. As you can see, it takes less time than the blanket stitch. So there you are. I will go off camera and sew a little more and bring back the results. Okay, almost done. This is what you want to do at the end. You want to knot your thread so it doesn't come unwound. And there we go. So, you can see here, whip stitch, and blanket stitch. So on your sample, choose a small motif, and you will sew some with the whip stitch, some with the blanket stitch, and some with the zigzag by machine. Now I've shown you free motion zigzag attaching an applique, but I'm going to show you one where you're actually going to just steer it on the machine. So this is what's called an open toe embroidery foot. It's going to make your life easier if you can get one. They make them for most machines. And really, the stitch width is 1.5 and the stitch length is 1.0. So this is a fairly narrow zigzag. And as you can see here, I'm just steering this through the machine, overcasting the outer edge of the lace motif, like so. This is actually quite quick. You know, you have to be a little bit accurate, but so whether you sew by free motion or letting the feed actually drive itself, this is the zigzag stitch. You would also use this on sewing the lace seam, which we'll get to in a little bit. So now I'm going to work around the piece and I will return back here when I'm finished. As you can see, I'm coming up on the end. And here we are. Trim the thread. Let me show you the result here. So as you can see, we started here and we worked all the way around. So there are two ways of attaching this with a zigzag. One is free motion, which you saw earlier. This is just steering. This is what it's going to look like from the back. And then we're going to go back to the work table to finish. So as you can see here, I removed the basting. Now I'm trimming out the back of the applique. And once I have this trimmed out, I will turn it over so you can see the results. So your sample is going to have three kinds of stitching. It's going to have the blanket stitching, it's going to have the whip stitching, and it's going to have the machine zigzag. Those are going to be the three means of attachment that you show on your sample. Like I said, you can have them all on one sample, sort of like I've done here. I just think it's fair that you do that. Okay, almost done here. There we are. So as you can see, I've trimmed out. And when you turn it over, part of the charm is that you can see through it. So here we are, everything trimmed out, and you can see the three different kinds of stitching. We have the blanket stitch, the whip stitch, and the machine zigzag. Those are the three examples, so you can have them all in one sample here. So there we have appliquing lace to solid fabrics.